You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. You're listening to Disruptive Adventism, a podcast about community, conversation, and conflict, where your ideas, traditions, and practices can be analyzed and changed. My name is Jose Briones, and I invite you to listen, to learn, and to live a life of purpose and disruption. In today's Disruptive Adventism, we're going to be talking about the topic of human trafficking. So we really hope that you appreciate this discussion. And for this discussion, we have invited Alex Niculaescu to be with us and to talk about why is it necessary that Adventist churches and we as a whole, as a community, start discussing the topic of human trafficking. How's it going, Alex?
Doing well. Thank you for having me, Jose.
Thank you for being here and for talking about this very important topic. We really appreciate your time. So before we get started, we always like to get to know our guests. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So I'm American-born to immigrant parents that were escaping communism in Eastern Bloc country of Romania in the late 70s. Came here in the early 80s, and I was born, and my brother. And we grew up for the most part in the States, but I especially, I've spent a lot of time overseas, just trying to broaden my horizons, trying to learn different things. And it was through some of these experiences of exposing myself to different cultures and situations where I came across the issue of slavery, modern-day slavery, and became deeply interested in it and became more aware of the breadth of the issue and just began working for a number of years, for the past about 7-8 years or so, with the various nonprofits and organizations, even government on certain occasions, in terms of collaboration, not directly. And yeah, that's kind of been in a nutshell, just kind of how I got to where I am right now.
You called human trafficking this topic modern day slavery. Can you unpack that concept for us a little bit more?
Well, to me, basically slavery is the world's oldest business. And, you know, if I look in the context of like the Great Controversy, slavery is the mechanism by which Satan has tried to get all people underneath his control. And slavery can manifest itself in various ways. And we generally have a very small view of what slavery is. And even when we say things like human trafficking, we have this single image in our mind where it's somebody, you know, running, grabbing somebody, stuffing them into like, you know, a van with no windows and then like rushing off, and then all of a sudden they're sold. And that's why I try to not use so much human trafficking, because human trafficking is a limited. It's one way that slavery manifests itself. And that's why I tend to go more towards just modern day slavery, because I think it's more encompassing of the issue at large.
How would you say that, you know, we can understand a little bit more about the different venues in which slavery may be presented itself today? You talk about maybe we're going to change the terminology, and I think that's very important. I appreciate your insight into that. But what are some of the other avenues? You presented a picture, you know, that's like somebody getting smuggled, like, you know, and all of that. But what are some of the other examples of modern day slavery for that you have understood?
That's a bit of a difficult question to unpack, because it's so broad, and it's really difficult for me to kind of convey certain experiences that you have in the field, or that you've seen in words. And when you deal with something as deep and as dark as slavery, like it just becomes something that it affects you, and it just becomes difficult to communicate. But if I were to basically, I like to break things down to principle. What is the underlying driving force of slavery? And the way that I would, I guess, break it down would be the exploitation of someone else's vulnerability for the sake of your own gain or profit. So I would say that all forms of slavery are a moderate to extreme version of that principle. The reason that I say that is because at some level, we all express that principle. So, for example, if I were to give you an image, I would say, a little kid, he wants to watch TV. Mom says no. So what does he do? He goes and he knows that dad hasn't talked to mom. So he goes and he talks to dad and gets dad to say yes. And all of a sudden he watches TV and then mom and dad argue. What he did is he manipulated the situation for the sake of his own gain. The little kid was smart enough to know that, if mom and dad haven't talked, that he could take advantage of the situation. He can get his own end. The idea of slavery is that to an extreme. It's basically saying that I want to get my way at the cost of other people's safety or life or whatever it may be. I believe actually there's a really good verse in Proverbs chapter 1 that actually explains it. The very first counsel that Solomon gives in Proverbs chapter 1 is actually don't engage with people who exploit others for the sake of their own gain.
That's very powerful because I think it not only encompasses extreme ideas, but are subtle taking advantage of others. And I think that that's what you're trying to express. Now, you provided and you have been engaged in this space for a little while, and you shared that through your travels, you kind of fell upon this new environment. Can you share with us a little bit of what happened when you were traveling that kind of like got you engaged in this scene?
Sure. Well, I was living in Kenya at the time, and a friend and I were basically living in the Masai Mara. We were working for the Masai tribe, building a orphanage for girls that were escaping FGM, or female genital mutilation, which is practiced among traditional tribes. Even though it's been outlawed, they still do it as a rite of passage and a type of social control. And you would think that just being exposed to that, I would get it. But surprisingly, that wasn't actually... It was the entry, but it wasn't that changed my mind. It was actually that same experience. We ended up driving to Sudan while that friend and we ended up driving to Sudan, and we were working near the border with the Congo, and we were building a house for a pastor, and there was this one little 8-year-old girl that would always act very oddly. And I took note of her behavior, and I said, well, okay, she's acting a little bit crazy. So if they were playing tag, there were some boys chasing her, she would all of a sudden stop, she would freak out, she'd start taking sticks and sticks and stones and things like that and throwing at the kids. And when it was girls chasing her, it was just normal behavior, as you would expect during tag. So I thought, well, why is she that way with just boys? So I kind of just put it off. I called her crazy girl, whatever. One day I didn't see her playing with the kids, so I asked one of the locals who was helping me mix cement that day, where's Crazy Girl? And he said, well, she's with her husband. And I looked at him kind of odd, and I said, dude, that's a stupid joke. And he said, well, I'm not joking. He said, you notice, like, we're in the middle of nowhere here. All right, this village is, like, dying. Like, all the men have left. There's no money in South Sudan. They've all gone to either Uganda or Kenya or some other places. They go to work, they make money. Some of them start new lives, get new wives, have new children. Some of them come back, maybe 3 months, 6 months, whatever. Her dad never did. And so her mom ended up selling her to one of the last remaining men in the village. And whenever he wants to, he just takes her home and basically uses soap and water because there's nothing else available, and ultimately just rapes her. And in the morning, she doesn't want to go home. She can't walk home. And I was at the point where I had a level of anger that was almost uncontrollable, but I thank God that I was able to stop myself from reacting, because my very first reaction was, I'm going to go kill this guy. Just show me where he lives. I'm going to go kill this guy. And I stopped myself and I began running through the situations. Okay, well, can I get across the border to Uganda? I went through the options. No, can't do that. What are some other things that I can do? We're a bunch of foreigners here. Sudan's in a very precarious situation. It's going through the referendum that, it was a few years before the actual referendum. They were trying to split from North Sudan, and I was just saying, this is a very tenuous situation. I can't think of how I can get her out of it. And I was like, oh, this is hopeless. But ultimately, I wasn't the one that was hopeless. She was. Because at the end of the day, I get to go home, and she gets no choice at all. She gets to wake up every single morning with somebody forcing her into a life that she didn't choose for herself. And that's going to be the rest of her life, and she's going to die that way. And I was upset. I was upset with myself, not just with just the situation. I was upset with myself with not knowing what to do. So when I got back to Kenya, I looked at the situation that I was there. I looked at it very differently. And all of a sudden I got back to the States, I started looking at every situation differently and started going to conferences, started reading books, started watching documentaries, anything that I could to expose myself to the issue.
I don't know what to say right now. You probably see my face. Listeners are not able to see my face. And when you said the words, he takes her, that's her husband, I literally reacted. And there's anger in me in the same way that probably there was anger in you at the time. And there's still anger in me. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know if you can share maybe a little bit more. Like it's a very hard situation. And I really don't know what to say. But when you started becoming more aware of this, how does this happen in our local context here in the United States? You shared something that for some of us, or for some maybe listening, will be like, well, that happens over there. What am I going to do? But this is happening here too. And how is it happening here? I think that's the question that we need to kind of delve. And maybe you can share other stories that you kind of have been encountering as you go.
Well, the thing is that in terms of the United States, we may not have child brides. That's true, right? That's illegal. That'd be highly frowned upon. I mean, no one would even assume to try to take an 8-year-old for a wife. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who don't sleep with 8-year-olds. They just do it within a very different context. And so is there a demand for it in this country? Absolutely. And so is there somebody going to supply it if there's a demand for it? Sure. And the issue is, because it is something that is not socially acceptable, it has to become something that goes ultimately underground. And the moment that it goes underground, it means you could reach new levels, meaning people with higher status within society that can do things in secret and can, because of their influence and because of their finances, maintain the level of anonymity and maintain this web of secrecy where these entire networks can be established and be pretty well protected. And I think mafia is used a lot to do that. So if I were, for example, I worked for a number of years with a friend of mine, a few friends of mine. He was a lawyer. He started the very first 24-hour call center in Georgia for victims of trafficking and prostitution. And I was his first volunteer. We was like a group of 12 of us in the room. We were his first volunteers. We created a protocol for how to answer calls, how to rescue people that call into the hotline and stuff like that. We made a network and whatnot. And we did that for about 3 or so years. And in that time, we were only dealing with what I would say would be level 1 and maybe level 2 of the issue. And over the years, I've come to establish that there's about 5 levels or 5 tiers of slavery or trafficking. Level 1 is the small town pimp. The guy that, finds some girl in some neighborhood who's troubled or whatever, uses some tactics to basically get her into the thing. Could be coercion, could be manipulation, could be force. But he's a small town pimp. He's got maybe 3 girls, maybe 4 girls, just a very small stable. That's what they call it. And that's level 1. Level 2 is a little bit more organized. He's got, there's a bit of a network. He's got more influence, more reach, might have higher end clients, not just Johns on the street. And they're trying to change that word because there's a lot of people named John that take offense to that. But level 3 would be organized crime, mafia, large rings, escort services, things that are more organized for the wealthy and things like that. Level 4 would be kind of like famous people, high-level escorts, prostitution, things that go on in these parties and things like that you never hear about. And then level 5 would be basically Satanism and pagan religion, where people are used in case of ritual. And, a lot of people will probably scoff at some of these. And that's understandable, because if you're not exposed to it, it's not going to make sense to you. And it's going to seem very conspiratorial, but, I assure you that it's not. And I know there's a lot of conflict in the news and the media in reference to things like, level 4s and level 5s, and obviously because they have things that they need to protect, but it definitely exists, and you don't have to take my word for it, but that's kind of what I've tiered it.
That seems to be a very interesting system, at the very least. I mean, you're sharing. What is our church response so far into this conversation? Do we even have one?
Well, not on an official basis, no. And I think that, there are some, I've spoken over the years, I've spoken to a few people that are involved, like maybe in Thailand, Cambodia, or in India, or places like that. There's some missionaries that are trying to do something. As a whole, I don't think we've done very much, and I don't think we've really brought the issue to light too much. I think we're trying to tiptoe a little bit around it, because it brings up a lot of other issues, and I think that from what I've seen, the church is trying to address those first. And it's starting with things like, the campaign for stopping domestic and spousal abuse, that whole thing, and then trying to deal with child abuse cases in the church, how to mitigate those, because there are child sex offenders that attend our churches and things like that. I think that there's a little bit more awareness in terms that there's actually child abuse that has happened within the church that has been somewhat covered up, but I think that it's not something that they're going to want to, like, oh, hey, this is what's been going on over the years. It's still going to take some time before a lot of these things are uncovered. So I think they're taking their time. It's going step by step. They don't want to jump into things that would be a little bit out of the control. I mean, just jumping into human trafficking, or obviously counter human trafficking, you immediately have to deal with abuse. You immediately have to do with all levels of abuse, whether it be child abuse within the church or even domestic abuse, because most of the trafficking that happens in the United States begins in the home. I remember there was a pimp that was quoted saying, "I really have to give it to the fathers because they're the ones who started up in her training. I just picked up where he left off." And that's a very general quote. I mean, that's what he said, but what he's basically saying is that most of the people that end up having vulnerabilities that expose them to predators is because there are issues in the home, usually a family, parent, or friend, or church member that has already created that vulnerability in them that will allow a predator to seek it, to find it, and to exploit it. So I don't know what the church's response is as a whole. I haven't seen very much specifically in counter trafficking. Whether they're going to get there eventually is my hope, but I honestly don't know.
Since this encompasses other topics like abuse, like domestic violence, and violence as a whole, like, I mean, trafficking is just under violence. That's just what it is, violence towards the other. What can we do as people that we go to church and, to encourage these conversations, to maybe inform ourselves about it?
Well, I definitely think becoming informed is necessary. So just literally the same thing that I did when I was ignorant of it. I exposed myself to as many things as I could in relation to the topic as possible. I went to conferences, I watched documentaries, and I read books and all that kinds of stuff. And I went and talked to people and read articles and research. And obviously you end up learning how to filter through it, because not all of it is correct, and you form your view over time. It's not going to be an instant thing. I can't give you my experience. I can't give you anything. You literally, it takes time for you to learn how to deal with it. But the idea is that if you know that it's there, you can't ignore it. And if you begin looking at how to deal with it, maybe you'll actually begin doing something. I would be afraid, to be honest with you, to just tell people, yeah, go out there and do something. Why? Because I've seen so many people in the years that I've been working who have good intentions, but they show up and they would do more damage than good because they don't understand. And, they don't understand that person's situation. They have these views and these concepts that are just, they haven't been rightly formed because they haven't been exposed to the issue for a long enough time. And so I think that understanding of how to deal with the issue grows with time. Your compassion grows with time. Your understanding grows with time. And your desire also grows with time. So exposing yourself, becoming informed is obviously a first step. The second would be, and I don't know if we have time to go into this, but basically I would say you need to understand spiritual warfare. You need to become acquainted with the reality that the great controversy is not just some concept that we talk about. It's actually real. There's actually people that are living and dying because of what is going on, this war over humanity. And the more you become aware of it, the more you realize that intercessory prayer is absolutely inextricable from the work. And you're also going to have to pray for wisdom and knowledge because you're going to mess up. You're going to confront some things and you're going to see some things that humans are not meant to see. And you need to be protected. You need the presence of God. You need angels. You need the Holy Spirit to keep you from breaking down from some of the things that you see, some of the things that you deal with. And so learning spiritual warfare and about intercessory prayer, becoming informed, I would say those are the two first steps that anybody would need.
I think your second step is definitely resonates a lot. And maybe this is, like you said, another conversation for another day. But the way that we view prayer, we see prayer as a way to communicate with God, and that rightly so. But I think viewing it from a perspective of deliverance and how prayer can deliver you and others from sin and from the effects of sin as a whole, I think takes it to another level that we may not be ready to discuss, or at least I am starting to reflect on as you were speaking, like, okay, yeah, I need to do maybe a little bit more of that intercession for others. And I think that as churches, maybe we can encourage this conversation for human trafficking, for modern day slavery and all of its models, not necessarily only for those who are victims of trafficking, but in all its aspects, arenas. And I think that definitely starting with a strong community will be a first step. And of course, getting informed and doing prayer and understanding spiritual warfare. Now, when it comes to this idea of abuse, you mentioned abuse, violence, domestic or otherwise, and how it kind of perpetuates these environments for girls and boys to be taken by, I guess, stepfathers, figures or figures that, or stepmothers. Women also, participate in these. How can we create a safe space within our churches, within our culture, within our community, that really fosters the communication and the awakening so that people are not falling into these traps, per se?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure about the first step myself. And there's a few parameters that I wish I could change. And one of them is transparency and vulnerability. And I think they go hand in hand. I think that a lot of us are afraid to be transparent because that makes us vulnerable. And I think that Jesus himself made himself vulnerable in certain ways. He made himself vulnerable to people's misunderstanding and attacks. And, I think that many of us are afraid to be misunderstood. All of us have sinned. We've all done some really stupid stuff in our life. And maybe we're still continuing to do it. And the thing is, as long as there's not an open communication where people can say, hey, I have an issue with lust, or I have pornography, or whatever, those kinds of things. If there's not a safe place to begin talking about that, then you're not able to deal with something that could eventually develop into a trait that is exploitative. And so I would say that working on the lines of prevention is you have to learn to deal with the issues of the time. And lust is one of the ways that is being so pushed upon us. Like everywhere you look is some form of pornography. I mean, you can't walk down the street without seeing somebody in a bikini, like, in a billboard or something. And, in ads, everything is an ad now. You go on YouTube, it's an ad. You go on Facebook, it's an ad. And there's things that always pop up. There's things that are always there. Whether you want to look at stuff or not, we're being exposed to things. And we're also being exposed to things through messages and music and messages and media and all this. And, we live in an information overload where we can't handle it. And we end up breaking down and just kind of accepting everything without realizing that's what we're doing. And so what we need is to take a little bit of a break. We need to take a step back. We need to stop being authentic. I would say, close down I'm not saying shut it down completely, but, close your technology, your tech stuff for a little while and have some real relationships. Most people are hiding behind tech, right? They're not communicating openly. They're not having deep, meaningful relationships with people anymore. You can't resolve things that way. In order for you to fix bonds, you need to actually relate to the people in physical, like in your physical presence, not to people in some other country or some other state or whatever through social media. Start dealing with the people closest to you. Start creating meaningful relationships with the people closest to you and allow yourself to be known. Be vulnerable. And also have the type of compassion and wisdom in how to deal with other people's issues that you may not understand. Say, Lord, I don't understand how to deal with this, but I'm going to trust that because I'm open and this person's open and we're being open, that you're going to teach us how to deal with these issues, that you're going to remove these sins from our lives, and that you're going to strengthen our bonds one to another. Ultimately, the family is what Satan's trying to destroy, and slavery is one of the mechanisms. It's one of the ultimate manifestations of the destruction of the family. So if you want to build a strong family, you have to learn how to build strong bonds. So I don't know. That's obviously not the only solution. That's just one of the things that comes to mind is we literally need to learn how to build authenticity, to be vulnerable, to stop living in vicarious lives through whatever means they may be, that we oftentimes escape from our own lives. And that doesn't deal with the issue. That just puts a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying and definitely resonate with the idea of, relating to people in the space. And also, I guess using the mediums that we have, like Facebook, social media, whatever, wisely, I guess, because they have this value to promote. It's like if you're escaping reality is different than if you're going to the virtual reality to expand your reality, and to kind of like reach other people, like you say, somebody from the other side of the world. You can create a bond. It's a different kind of bond, but you can still...
No, absolutely. I definitely think that social media has its place. But one of the things is that we've advanced so quickly that many of us have not learned how to adapt to it properly. And it's taken a little bit more over our lives than we've been able to, to manage. Exactly. So I'm not demonizing any of the outlets or technology. I think that it can be used for a lot of good, and I use it for a lot of good. But I do think that it needs to be properly managed and understood.
Balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And not at the cost of personal relationships.
Good to hear. We are kind of running out of time here, but I really want to thank you for sharing the experience that you shared. Mm-hmm. I think just with that, listening to that kind of awakened me to understand that there's a bigger problem here than we can see and just, share. You shared that you started watching documentaries, seeing different, books and resources. What are some of those that people can tap into to start learning and maybe share in their communities and their churches?
Well, some of the documentaries, my number one documentary that I watched a number of years ago, and it was pretty powerful, was Nefarious. Good documentary done by a group out of Kansas City called Exodus Cry, Nefarious Merchant of Souls. And then there's a few YouTube documentaries that you can get for free. One of them is The Conspiracy of Silence, and it was a documentary that was supposed to show up on TV and ended up being banned, but you can find some copies of it on YouTube. And then 2020 did a thing on prostitution in America. And there's a few others, like Born into Brothels, The End of Slavery from International Justice Mission, Not My Life, Sex and Money, Very Young Girls, from a group called GEMS, GEMS. I believe they're out of New York. And a number of books as well. But you can probably find these resources if you go to my website, cryingatthegates.com. I have a list under resources, and it'll have a list of books, both on prayer and spiritual warfare, as well as on human trafficking per se, and a longer list of films and documentaries.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I'll put it in the show notes. Definitely make sure to put that information out there. I guess another one to mention is End It Now, from, I think it's North American Division that sponsors that, mm-hmm. right? So End It Now, I'll also put it in the show notes. And I think this is a very, very important conversation that we need to have. And I want to thank again your time that you have given it to us to speak just a little bit about this and about the things that we can do as a community to engage and to not just use our time to, just mindlessly not think, about the importance of the different things that are happening around us, around our world. As it is our, tradition here at Disruptive Adventism, we like to give the final word to our guests. So what's the final word on modern day slavery?
Well, I think that it's something that we can't ignore. Slavery is bigger, it's broader, and it's deeper than it's ever been in history. And if you've studied the history of slavery and you've been involved in what's going on today, that's undeniable. There are more people enslaved in a greater variety of ways than ever before. And to turn your eyes away from it, I think, is probably the greatest sin that we could do. One of the things that got me to go to Brazil in 2014 to counteract human trafficking during the World Cup was one verse in the Bible. And that's the verse that I want to leave you with. And we always read John 3:16, but I like 1 John 3:16, 17, and 18 as well. By this perceive we the love of God, and that God gave his life for us, and we also ought to give our life for the brethren. If any of you has this world's good, and sees his brother have need, and shuts up his bowels of compassion, how dwells the love of God in him? The answer is, it doesn't. It doesn't. I did not feel like going. I did not feel like doing it. I did not feel like I wanted to give up at some point because I was so overwhelmed. And I thought to myself, this verse came to mind. If I know that this is going on, and even if I don't feel like doing anything about it, even if I feel powerless against it, if I see somebody in need and I shut up my bowels of compassion, I close my heart to them, I look away in the other direction, how does the love of God dwell in me? The answer is it doesn't. And I don't want to be the person who the love of God does not dwell in. I want the love of God to dwell in me. And so it says, let us not love in word, but let us love in truth and in deed. And I hope that's ultimately what we choose to do, to not be just people who mouth our goodness and our love for others, but ones that actually act upon it and go out there and do something.
You've been listening to Disruptive Adventism. We hope that today's topic helped you to think and change something about your practices, about your faith, about your Adventism. If you want to subscribe, make sure to go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. We'll be there. And make sure to give us a review if you like what you're listening to. If you want to support, make sure to go to patreon.com/Disruptive Adventism. It helps us pay our bills and produce the content that you're listening to. And if you want to socialize, make sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram or on Twitter, and hit us up whenever you need anything. We'll be there to support you. Thank you for listening today. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we invite you to be disruptive.